probably from my mum and dad. So my dad was a rock and roll fan, and my mum was a classical music fan. So I had this really interesting and fairly diversely strange, simple on one side, simple because rock and roll was simple. It was effectively 3 or 4 chords and beats that were designed to make people dance. So that was his house music, 100%. That was his club music. And my mum at the time was still going to church on a Sunday when we were very young. She kind of, I think she became agnostic a few years later. But as she would go, my dad would get the Reader's Digest Elvis collection out, or the Reader's Digest hits from the 60s and 70s, which is when he was a teenager, and the music that you absorb when you're a teenager hits you harder than anything else you'll ever come across, and you'll always remember it. So for him, it was reliving a bit of that with his 2 young kids, and we just used to muck about in the front room, play fight, all that kind of stuff. And I always remember the Reader's Digest Elvis collection. He had it was like a collection of about 8 albums, and when you turned them over, there was like a mosaic of Elvis Presley from the Las Vegas days with a sparkly suit on, all in black. When all you saw were the sparkles and the microphone in his head, effectively. Wow. And we would always try and put them together. But look, even though that's a visual memory, it was constantly on a loop of 60s and 70s, effectively rock and roll and beat music. But then my mum would always be playing classical music, and she loved the melodies of the traditional. I think her favourite was always Handel's Water Music. But we went through an awful lot, and I was fascinated at that point with how some would sound incredibly present and jolly, and some would sound sad and just the emotions connected with the different styles were completely different. And of course later on I found that was the difference between major and minor. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that all the rock and roll stuff, as I found out later on, was pretty much all in major keys. It was very up with the blues scale thrown in there for good measure. So I was kind of grounded, I suppose grounded on almost 2 things that could have turned in later on in the 70s to disco. Now rock and roll, particularly if you take original R&B, and particularly we're talking about the ones sourced from African American artists, that eventually changed into funk and soul, and funk, soul and classical music combined into disco. But I still remember the very first time I actually heard a disco record, which was in a roller blading club in the local sports centre. I was a young teenager at the time, and there were some Chic remixes doing the rounds in the 80s, and I was gone. I was like, what is this stuff? I'd never heard it before. I was too young to remember it in the 70s, and we weren't really a disco house, or a disco household, I should say. So then, yeah, it's an interesting step up as I can see it now, but always originally that's what I remember, the mixture of rock and roll and classical.
It's funny how many people mention those roller skating events of music. Yeah, they seem to be a big deal for a lot of people, and in terms of like a lot of musical influences in there, like you say, in your teenage years. There's a lot of stuff there. What sort of rock and roll bands was your dad listening to?
His biggest one. He was a massive Elvis fan. To be honest, his social media handle still contains the word Elvis in it now. But we grew up in the same town as the Trogs were from. So he was really into the Trogs, the Kinks, and not so much the experimental stuff. He liked the really melodic and well-written songs. He was a massive Buddy Holly fan. But it was, he was born and became interested in music just as all that bloomed. And it must have been, God, it must have hit this country like he comes from a small town in the country. It must have been incredible for him to have access to that. So for me to hear all of that from the first time, you could hear the rawness in it. And particularly I was fascinated with, again, the Trogs and the Kinks and the guitar sounds, and everything sounded so powerful. And everybody meant it. I think that was the other thing. You could feel the emotion that was recorded from those things, that you could almost tell they were doing something for the first time.
Yeah, and having like new technology was moving so quick, so they could there was interesting ways of recording and doing things like that. But yeah, also the legacy of that time as well is still relevant today.
Oh yeah.
across the world. You know, you go abroad and people are still talking about the British 1970s rock and roll scene. So yeah, I imagine being there at that time, it must have been something almost tangible.
Yeah, and I always remember seeing the energy in my dad from listening to the music that he loved, and that then later on rubbed on to me. But it was interesting that my mum's music also had a massive influence. I was always taken with melody, to the point where, particularly as I really got into dance music as a producer, I had to force myself to look at the bass end. A number of my early things that I were doing, I wasn't concentrating on the bass end, I was worried about the top melodies, and I think my absorption and ability to be able to work with those has taken away sometimes from making sure that that groove is exactly accurate. So in my early career, I knew that that was a problem, and I had to really adjust a little bit later on, and probably all the way through my career I've had to always make sure, and now I'm fascinated by bass end, so I'm always down at that part of the track seeing what's going on. But yeah, at the beginning, I think my biggest failing as a producer was that I'd got too obsessed with the melody side of things, and often it's about power and rhythm, particularly club.
Yeah, the root of it. Yeah, I guess everybody grows up with things that they really focus on and like weaknesses. But as I see it, I mean, in your music and your musicality, I think you have so much talent across the board in the music that you make. I've even been out in Brighton and in shops and heard a track, and I'm like, that's James's bass line. I just know that's his bass line, and it was. So yeah, you have a tremendous like musicality, as well as all of it across the board in terms of production. So yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about where that musicality came from for you as someone producing.
So
or
production,
making music.
If we go back to when I was really young, I still remember walking to school one day, and I could hold a melody in my head, and it was my melody. It was crap, don't get me wrong, I can't even remember it now, and it was probably rubbish. But for me, I still remember leaving school in the evening and then walking back. It was about a mile walk back to my home, and from my primary school. It was in the good old days when you could do that without having to get picked up. And I'd managed to hold the memory, remember it from walking into school. And without doubt, that's my first memory of writing anything. Not that I could play or anything or do anything with it, but I could hold it in my head. And I still remember that moment. I can almost remember the road as it was, had a kind of rough car park. And I remember walking past this car park and brushing my feet against some grass that had overgrown because it hadn't been tended. And on the way home and thinking, no, I can remember that. That's significant. And okay, what does that mean? Didn't do anything with it for a few years, and then someone turned up at my school with a violin and played it in front of me. It was a violin teacher looking for students, and I think she played the theme from Popeye or something like that. She played something but it was so well played. You're like, oh my god! And I think I feel sorry for my parents, but bless them, they did buy me a violin, and I started learning that. Oh my god, it's hard work. It's absolutely horrendously hard work. I take my hat off to any professional fiddle player, because I just think the control that you need in the discipline and the accuracy, and that was the bit I always struggled with. So that lasted about a year or so. And then my violin teacher actually went on maternity, and I don't think she was able to return back. I think naturally she's got a child and she couldn't do all of the time that she was doing, so that kind of petered out. I remember someone else coming to collect the violin. I got interested in the first computers were coming about, and someone on Facebook the other day posted a picture of like Windows 3 and said, I'm that old. I'm like, that's nothing, mate. I put a picture of my first computer up, a Commodore VIC-20.
Really, VIC-20? That's
32.
Really
was it like 5 kilobytes of memory, man?
I've just interviewed today. A podcast episode is going out with a guy called Tim Wright, who did all the music for Wipeout, and he did music on the PlayStation. And he started out on a VIC-20 as well. That's such a strange correlation.
Well, it was. I mean, they sold. I wouldn't like to imagine. I mean, look, it's so bizarre that these companies don't exist now, because they had the market, man. They all the way up from the VIC-20, the Commodore 64, and then the Amiga. there was always a sound thing going on with those things. So I think the VIC-20 had a SID chip in it, or was it the 64? Maybe the Commodore 64, but it would make noise. So that was the most fascinating thing in the world to me. It was, you know, you could play games on it, you'd get magazines and type the whole code in for a rubbish game that's in today's standards, but you know, the whole family would go and play it. I remember my sister going, "Oh, you've got the high score on this some rubbish thing," and then you'd have to save it off onto cassette and then load it back on cassette, and then every now and again the cassette would get dirty, and then all your work's gone, you got to type it all out again. Anyway, long complicated story, but all of these things, I remember the beginnings of computer music happening. Now, I was too young at the time to really take any interest in the charts or anything like that, but my sister was buying all of the music, so one of her friends from school gave her this brilliant collection of cassettes with all of the stuff that he'd recorded from the radio, and she lent them to me when I got a cassette player as I was getting older, and I discovered it all then. I just all the stuff from a few years back, and then I said, "Look, can I borrow some of your record collection?" And she had like Blue Monday, New Order 12-inch and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, and my brain was starting to explode at this point.
That's
of
incredible.
Possibilities. And then when we upgraded the Commodore VIC-20 to a Commodore 64, we went off to Winchester, and it was fireworks night. I'll always remember this. And I'd saved up a bit of money, and my dad was going to get it for me. It was part of my birthday that had been a few months before. The thing had only just been available, so off we went. And the reason we went to Winchester is there was this music keyboard, that was made out of plastic and would fit over the top of the keys of the Commodore 64.
I think I had one at one point, sold it,
it's dreadful, because it's one of those things that you think, oh, this is amazing. Honestly, it's not.
It's the same as pressing the keys, it just looks better.
But it was for me, because this thing had a selection of different sounds, and you could play some notes. Now, one of my best friends from school came over for a firework night at my parents' house. They had a nice big garden, we had a bonfire, loads of fireworks and all that kind of stuff. And I always remember us sat in front of the TV with it on, and my mum going, "We can't hear what we're saying back here. Can you two turn it down, please?" But from that moment, that was it. I was like, okay, musical keyboards don't just play piano notes. They do other stuff as well. And I was in secondary school at the time, and unfortunately the first music teacher at that secondary school don't think he really liked kids, if I'm honest. He eventually left, but he'd completely disinterested me in music by that point, of learning the actual notes and all the rest of it. And then, so I'd taken my options, didn't do music, and then on my last year at secondary school, this brilliant head of music came in. God, my goodness, I can't remember his name. I would love to remember it. A wonderful man. And I would always pop up to the piano rooms, I think, and have a little tinkle about. And, he caught me a couple of times in the theatre. There was a grand piano in there. And I was like, "Oh, I'm really sorry." He said, No. I've not seen you before. You're not in my class. What? And I was like, "Oh, I just, I kind of took my options because I wasn't really interested in it. But, I kind of really like it. And, but I'm really into electronic music." And he was like, "Right, come with me." Took me upstairs and he went, "Here's a CZ101, Casio synthesizer.
Excellent.
Learn it. You can come up here after school 3 or 4 times a week. If the rooms are empty, here's a little guitar amp. We'll plug it in and you can play with it."
Wow.
And that was amazing. And now I'm not his student. My trajectory is not going to affect any of his internal scoring that happens in school. I was aware of all of that at the time, that these guys are all motivated to get grades and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He just saw someone who was interested in the notes and went, "Okay, you need to investigate this. If you're interested in the electronics, here's a synthesizer." And my God, that thing is horrendous to program when you don't know what you're doing. I think around the same time I had a little a Yamaha Porter Sound. I think it was the 422, the one that had a little bit of very basic sound control that would allow you to alter what I now know is a 2-operator FM synth.
Yeah.
But it would record a little bit, and it had some dreadful drums that you could make a little pattern out of.
It was the same chip that's in the Sound Blaster sound card. It's the OPL2, I think, and so you'll notice that the video games on the 486s that you would use your Sound Blaster in there's the same FM, 2-operator FM that's in the video game. So there is an 8-bit guy video on that Portasound range of keyboards, and he calls them the Sound Blaster keyboards.
How funny!
So they've got such a strong character, like the wow, the sort of
yes, yeah. I mean, it was Yamaha's. I mean, brilliant thing to turn all of that technology into such into such mass market products, because that was a stroke of genius, and the whole range. I mean, I learnt all of my musical chops, effectively, the beginnings of them, from a little Portasound keyboard like that. But then I would go in and learn sound design with this CZ101, and it took me. I couldn't get anything that I wanted out of it until I realised that this was not a simple envelope. This was like this multi-stage envelope where it's a position and a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked it out, and I was like, oh my god, I can. And then suddenly I could change the timbre of the sound. I could change I could use the pitch envelope. I could use the volume envelopes of the different noises. And then, I must have been 13 at the time, 13, 14, maybe 14, 15, because it was in the last bit of school. But I'm like, man, and that little bit of knowledge meant that I could program pretty much any synthesizer I've ever come across since, because nothing is as complicated as the fucking envelope on the CZ101.
That's so cool, man. I mean, it's